All right, so hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Verdict. I'm Spray1000, and today I'm going to talk about Xenoblade Chronicles 3. This is the latest in the long-running Xenoblade series of games from Nintendo and Monolith Soft. And basically, it's the wrap-up of the entire Xenoblade trilogy. At least the initial part, Xenoblade Chronicles X, is considered to be its own separate thing. So, for the most part, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is an open world JRPG. You roam around, you can complete quests, you engage in combat in real time, and like with a lot of games nowadays, most of the combat, all the combat is done actually on the field. There's no transition, for instance, to like a separate fight area or anything like that, and you control 6 characters as they fight, grow, change classes, and all sorts of stuff. And that's one of the initial strengths about this game, is it really feels like a massive coming together of the JRPG genre as a whole. There's a lot of things I think that are really well done from a lot of other games and other previous Xenoblade games that are done really, really well here. So, for starters, right? The story of this game, to give a broad outline, is in the land of Ionios, two warring nations, Keves and Agnes, are constantly at war with one another. And initially, you play as Noah and his friends, Uni and Lance, who are a part of a special operations unit. They go around, they basically off-see various soldiers from their nation of Keves who have fallen in battle and return their energy back to their flame clocks, which are these big automatons that they're used for war, that are fueled by the life force of fallen comrades and fallen enemies. And through a complete stroke and twist of fate, right, they're able to unite with people from the opposite nation of Agnes, right, Mio, Senna, and Tyon. And eventually what happens is a massive plot line unfolds involving the entirety of the world and the nature of the balance of the war that's going on, and how they can finally stop it and break it and save the people that are constantly dying and fighting every day, living to fight, dying, and then living to fight, and then doing this for essentially as long as they remember and as long as time allows them to. So what's cool about it is that right off the bat, you have a game that's very similar. There's a lot of games that explore duality, right? There's a lot of games that explore two sides both fighting to survive, right? So for instance, like another game would be like Tales of Symphonia, so it's a very nice like sort of setup for the world. It's a very nice setup, for a lot of the dialogue and the character interactions and even the gameplay as well, right? A lot of the different classes. And that's one thing I think this game really has going for it, is that it juggles two themes really well, right? The theme of something repeating, cycles and constantly being trapped in them, as well as just the duality of different cultures, right? Two different nations both fighting for exactly the same thing, having so much in common and not being able to see past it. I like the characters. In this game, unlike a lot of other JRPGs, they go for the more Final Fantasy VI standard, where there's not really a main character per se. It's more like there's multiple characters, right? They focus very heavily on the 6 main characters instead of just focusing purely on Noah and his standpoint and his characterization, right? Which is, I could understand why some people, especially in Xenoblade, where usually the main character gets the majority of the focus. I actually kind of like this twist, right? Because I prefer games where more than just the main character are built up. I never got the feeling that any one main character of the cast felt like a meme, like they felt like they were just there because they fit a certain mold or a criteria, right? Like, characters might have tropes about them, but I never felt, and this is something I liked about Three Houses as well, is I felt like every character, even beyond their tropes, was like an actual person. They do a good job characterizing it, right? And characterizing, especially the main cast, which is a little bit of a stark shift from some of the previous Xenoblade games, especially 2, where a lot of the cast members and a lot of the, main characters, even if they're not playable, felt like very obvious caricatures. They weren't completely, like throwaway like some of the early Fire Emblem characters, where they literally exist around one dynamic and one character point. But I did like that everyone felt like a fleshed out unit. They felt like a fleshed out, really completely like written out character. And that goes a long way, especially when you have a game story that's this long, to have characters that have motivations. They're not just 2D motivations as well. They're very thought out and fully fleshed out. I think I've said that like 3 times now. And for starters, right, like the main 6 are good, but then there's a whole like supporting cast of characters that I'll get into in a little bit that also add to gameplay as well. But it was cool to see that all of these characters were fun to interact with. They had quests that were for the most part pretty fun, or expanded on the world and expanded on your knowledge of the world. I really like that the more and more you get into the story, you get into the characters, you get into doing stuff for everybody, the more you really get like an understanding of how the world works, how these characters have operated for years. I really think that that's a big part about JRPGs that I'm seeing more of, and the more I see it, the more I like it. So just in general for the future, I hope more games do that, right? The themes of the game, right, which are just infinity basically, right? Like it's the idea of an infinite cycle playing itself out on loop again and again. It's the usual kind of Xenoblade thing. That's definitely one of the bigger ones that they added for this one, right? Like the idea that time is cyclical, people will do the same mistakes over and over again. Let's live in the infinite now, and all sorts of stuff, which are big parts of the story. I like how they handle it a lot more than some other games I think that have done this. It's pretty well handled. It's definitely intriguing, right? It's almost a mystery up until the very end exactly what's going on. There's not like a real aha moment and then everything sort of snaps into place, which is something I like about it. But the story is good. Obviously, I don't want to spoil it here because Xenoblade is a very story-centric series, but I definitely enjoyed it. I really like the characters and their dynamics. So to start, a lot of the story is replicated or not replicated. It's very emphasized in the gameplay. As I said, you control 6 different people in this game. One of the biggest additions that they added for this game is that if you're in combat or even just out in the field, just with a couple taps of a button, you can switch between whatever character you're controlling. Now, if you're out in the field, it just changes your avatar. If you're in combat, you actually will switch over to that person, right? So you don't teleport people around, which I think is a big, big, big positive, right? If that's one of the things I would say about Xenoblade games, it always felt to me like they were meant to have more than 3 people out on the field at any given time, and then that way, you could switch between them, play around with their different moves and stuff, adapt to situations. And 1 doesn't let you do that, which is a kind of a detriment. The game, I think, is pretty reasonably balanced around 3 people, but it's just not very fun when I feel like the couple of people you really need to have are that are essential are more or less locked. It really lets characters fall by the wayside. And in 2, where just between the blade system and just all these characters just kind of like, just 2's combat is not great. It's kind of bad. But this game, I think, solves this in a lot of unique ways, but I would say 2 or 3 unique ways. 1, everyone is deployed on the field at the same time in your party. All 6 people are deployed at the same exact time, meaning that you have everybody available at every given moment. There's never a moment when you enter a fight and you're like, damn, I wish I had this other person out. And that way I could, fight back, or I could use their special moves. No, everybody is deployed. All 6 people are deployed at once. And the second thing that they do is by giving you a lot of class customization in this game. There's a lot of ways to mix up your characters as they get through their different classes and change things up, right? And I think that those 2 big things, and also being able to swap in combat to a lesser degree, but it is still a good thing to have just in case you run a strategy where you might want to do that. I think that those 3 things are very important to why this game's combat is so good and so fun, right? Combat in this game takes place, as I said, on the world map. It takes place in real time. So you will either be coming across an enemy and initiate yourself, or an enemy will show up or come down to fight you, and then you'll initiate combat, or you could choose to run away. Right? Now, keeping in mind with the whole duality of the world, the two nations, each class has a different style of play based on what nation that class is derived from. So, for instance, Keva's base classes are more similar to class or to the class-based system that was used in Xenoblade 1, where your moves would recharge on a cooldown. So if you play Keva's classes, right, your cooldowns will you'll use a move and then your cooldowns will just tick around until they're full again. Like if you've ever played like an MMO or a game with any amount of like cooldown based as they call it, cooldown based arts, right? The Agnes-based class is probably more similarly to Xenoblade 2, where it's based off of your number of auto attacks that you land in between using these arts. And the differences between the two of these, right, is that the more you auto attack on an Agnes class, the faster you get to act, whereas Keva's base classes have just a cooldown that needs to fill around until you could use the move again, regardless of you auto attacking or not. Now, obviously, you'll want to auto-attack regardless, because auto-attacking allows you to deal damage. It's one of your primary methods of doing so, right? Now, the first thing I will talk about is that I feel that the Agnes-based moves are a little bit stronger in this game. I feel like the way that Xenoblade 3 balanced this, is that the Keva's-based classes have pretty long cooldowns. It's like 20 to 30 seconds on average, I would say, off the top of my head. But for the most part, up until I want to say like maybe the last quarter of the game, Agnes moves are really, really good in the sense that they have generally what feels like shorter cooldowns. Now, that does not mean that Agnes-based classes are inherently better, right? Even at the end of the game, I was still using a couple of Keva's classes. It just means I feel that because this system is closer to Xenoblade 2 than it is Xenoblade 1, it's just easier to use a lot of those classes. And I think a lot of this ties into the next part that I'm going to say, is that I wish that you had more moves in this game. You're only allowed to have 3, which is, again, more similar to Xenoblade 2 than it is to Xenoblade 1. In Xenoblade 1, you could have 8 and then your talent art. In Xenoblade X, you could have 8 and then Overdrive, which was, I think, a shared thing. And then in Xenoblade 2, they went down to 3 moves per character, but you got different blades, which was a clusterfuck of a system anyway. But beyond that, I really did like the whole... it's in this game, I think, again, they balanced it a bit better. I think that the moves you get are more meaningful, right? The moves that you get in Xenoblade 3 fit their roles just a bit better. Now, you are able to add an additional 3 moves onto your D-pad, basically, for every character. But those 3 moves have to be from the opposite side of classes, right? So if you're playing an Agnes class, right, on your main class on your character, you'll have 3 Agnes moves to choose from that class in particular. And then on your D-pad, you could put any Keva's base art onto your D-pad from any of the classes you've unlocked. Now, this system isn't... I would say that this system is pretty good. For the most part, there were a couple of moments where I was like, oh, I really wish I had this, or I really wish I had that art or something. But for the most part, like, I really think that this game does a good job of keeping things smoothed. There was never a moment when I was playing this game, other than a couple, small fights that I was like, oh, I can't beat this, or I can't figure this out. There was never a moment when I really had to stop and say to myself, damn, I can't figure this out, or something's not right about this. I always felt like I had a good amount of control, and I think that that's like one of the best parts about this game, is that there's a lot of control that they give you in classes, or in combat with your classes. But beyond that, I do think that there could have been maybe a little bit of a system where you can maybe upgrade your moves a bit more, maybe to reduce the cooldown. Maybe Keva's arts just need a little bit of a shorter cooldown, right? Because in Xenoblade 1, your arts have more or less pretty short cooldowns, right? Like, I would say, like, especially as you go throughout the game and you upgrade them, right? Your arts go from being maybe like 10, 12, 13, 18 second cooldowns down all the way into, like, I want to say... like an 18-second cooldown move at the start of Xenoblade 1 more or less goes down into a 12, 11, 10-second cooldown, right? It's almost like you take 40% of the cooldown off of the move. And I just kind of wish that, for a lot of the early moves and stuff in this game, while I like the art swapping, I really kind of wish that they did let you have a little bit more of a cooldown. Now, there is a buff that you can get later in the game, which basically allows you to get faster cooldowns and faster everything, which obviously is a must-have, right? To be able to have faster cooldowns on your arts to speed them up. So it kind of rectifies itself by the end. It wasn't even a big problem. It's just something I noticed, right? Now, I've talked about the different classes. Going off of Xenoblade 2, right? Again, because most of this game is a derivative of Xenoblade 2. Each class in this game has what's called a role, right? You're familiar with this if you've played any amount of games, right? So, for instance, you have your tank, your healer, and your damage dealing roles, right? It's very straightforward. There's not really like a ton to, it's not a crazy amount or anything like that. So what happens is that your tank roles are there to primarily grab aggro and to hold enemies' attentions and, just maybe a couple other things, but that's primarily what they're there for. Your damage dealers are there to put on the hurt, put a lot of big damage out, big numbers, and then, go from there, and that's primarily what they do. And then lastly, your healers are there. They've actually changed it up. In this game, healers are the only ones that can revive people. In previous Xenoblade games, anyone could revive anyone. If you had a bar of the chain art gauge, or the chain attack gauge, you could just run over and revive someone at the cost of 1 bar. Now, they've removed the 1 bar requirement, but in exchange, your healers now are the ones that can revive people. They're the only ones who can revive people. So it gives a more of an incentive for you to try to keep your healers alive, right? It gives more of a a gameplay element, right? Like now the healers aren't just pumping out heals and, maybe a little bit of damage. They also got to, support and do things. And there's an item later that lets anybody revive anybody. But for the most part, for most of the game, you will be basically trying to protect your healers while your tank is holding aggro on everything, while you yourself are putting out damage. Or you can play as the tank, or you can play as the healer. It's up to you. The AI is actually surprisingly competent for the most part in this game. There was very few moments where I felt like the AI was dropping the ball completely and just letting me completely down. Now, that said, if I could go into how each role plays, right, normally I like to play tank characters in games. I think it's really fun. I think it's enjoyable to try, especially tanking is not something that most AI can do, right? I feel like in order to tank in a lot of games, and don't get me wrong, this is not like an MMO where tons of AoEs are going off on the floor or something like that, right? Like, obviously, there's a degree of, like, tons of AoEs are not exploding all over the place, right? Like, for the most part, tanking in this game is a lot more simple than it would be in, like, an MMO or something else. But tanking is still something you need, to have like awareness. It's something it's hard really to get a computer to get, right? But I feel like the tanks in this game are good. My biggest complaint kind of again goes back to the whole cooldown based thing, is I feel like Kevez based tanks are really, really difficult to play because you're reliant, at least one of them, because there's I think is it 3 Kevez based tanks in the game? I think it's really hard to play with 2 of them, right? Because 2 of them are really dependent. Like there's no AoE moves, right? Like in order to get AoE moves, you have to combine arts, which I haven't talked about yet. But in order to get AoE moves out, you have to like, there's not really enough. And because your cooldowns are so long, I think it's really easy for other characters to come in, pump all the DPS, pump all the everything in, and then that's it. They've ripped it off of you. So in a lot of ways, I kind of wish that there was more of a spin move. It might be easier on every tank if there was an easy to use move to grab aggro, right? Now on bosses, obviously it's different because it's very rare that you fight a boss or fight any ads in this game. That's not really something that's too common. It just would be a little bit easier for tanking if you yourself had a move that just like spread everything around. And there are a couple, but they're not always accessible to you. Like I said before, if you're a Kevez based tank, you could take an Agnes based class, but if your auto attacks aren't fast enough, you won't charge it enough, and the more you move, you cannot move an auto attack in this game, which is once again something from Xenoblade 2 that they took. In Xenoblade X and in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, you are able to do it, so I'm not really sure. They just really don't like the idea that you can move and auto attack anymore. I'm not really sure why. But I think it would have been a better choice if they had decided, like, okay, well, you can move an auto, here's a move, right, to grab aggro and stuff, and then, like, each class has a different thing on it, like, different moves and stuff, like, different ways of handling it, but there's no way to make, like, a master level tank in this game, you know, which I guess leads me into my next thing, is that aggro in this game can be very confusing, right? Up until the very end of the game, your tanks are basically in charge of maintaining aggro. Now, aggro, as usual, is hate or enmity or whatever every other game calls it. It's a measure of how much a monster wants to fight one particular person, right? So in general, like I said, your tanks are responsible for holding all the damage taking all the damage and making sure monsters focus on them. This game does a very Final Fantasy 12 style system for aggro. Where monsters will shoot out a line, right? And that line is basically a visual representation of what that monster is going to attack, right? What they're going to hit, you know, what they're going to do. And the goal is to have that line be on a tank at all times, right? The goal is to have that line be blue. You want that line to be a blue line, meaning that it's on a tank. You don't have to worry about it, right? You know, you just heal as normal and you move on. If that line is red, that means that that enemy is targeting a DPS or a healer, right? And usually the AI is pretty good about figuring out how to manage its resources, right? To attack different monsters. Remember, you set up all 6 characters in this game. So, you know, the AI is playing by what you give it. You know, it's not like the AI has, you know, you customize only the character you play as and then you go from there. No, the AI will play off of what you give it based on what equipment and abilities you assign and things like that, and whatever class you assign as well. So your ability to do well in this game is very, very much involved on you being able to equip different things in your characters and understand their roles, right? The AI just merely fills in for the fact that you can't play 6 characters at once. So, like, it's not so much a matter that the AI can't handle tanking. I just wish that aggro was a little bit more, what's the word? I wish it was a little bit more understandable how the aggro system is in Xenoblade 3, right? Because what will happen is that you'll have your tank have something, the line will be blue, and what happens is that the more and more you attack something, or the more and more that tank loses aggro on an enemy, the line will start to wave and shake until finally, you know, that person passes the tank, and then, oh, look, well, now the tank has to take aggro back because now that monster's focusing on the DPS. I wish that there was a little bit more of a way for them to convey exactly, like, the exact numbers that are being used. Because I think what's a really big part of this game that you might not be used to in a lot of other games is enmity decays. Like, you lose aggro in this game pretty quickly, right? Like, and there's not, like, it took me until, like, halfway through the game to really realize that. Like, tanks will hit something, it'll give them a good boost of aggro, and then, like, if like, let's say you're alternating between 2 enemies, right? If you focus on one enemy too much, the other enemy will forget about you very quickly, especially if your teammates are using AoEs or fighting stuff. And, like, yeah, you can direct your teammates to focus on one enemy at a time, but it would just be nicer. I think most of these problems would be solved if every tank came equipped with, like, an easy to use, fast charging AoE move. But then you could argue that that would trivialize it a bit. I just think it would make some classes, especially the early game tanks, a little more appealing. Another thing that I'll get into later is that there's gems, which are basically like materia. They're like socketable jewels that you could give to your characters to change and alter and benefit their stats. A lot of the tank ones are pretty seemingly weak, and the DPS one for aggro isn't exactly that great either. It wasn't until, again, the end of the game where I was able to get my classes above rank 10, which you have to do special missions to do that unlock later in the game, that I was able to give all my DPS a special ability from one of the classes that reduces their enmity generated by 50%. At that point, the aggro problem ceased immediately. And I mean, it's not as bad as I would say Xenoblade 2, but it's not as good as I would say like Xenoblade 1. Because in Xenoblade 1, again, because you had 8 moves, you could afford to have a spin move on your tanks, right? You could afford to do a lot of this stuff, you know? So I think a large chunk of it comes down to a couple of systems bubbling together. It's not game breaking. It didn't ruin my experience like 2, right? But I would say that it definitely, again, the lack of extra moves and stuff definitely rears its head a little bit. And I wish there was a little bit more customization on that front. I feel like we're like 80% of the way there, but it works out and you could still play the game very well. Now, up until this point, I haven't really talked about Interlink. So going back to the whole main story portion, each character is basically paired forcefully when the two parties unite with someone else from the other nation. So for instance, Noah and Mio, who are the main characters from the different nations, are paired together in what's called an interlink. And during combat, what will happen is that each of your cast members, they can fuse together and become one bigger like creation, one bigger entity. And you could use this form to now fight enemies. You have special moves, you do more damage and stuff. But obviously you can only stay in it for a short while. So one of the big parts of combat is knowing how and when to use Interlink. Now, unfortunately, I would argue that Interlink might be one of my least favorite parts of the game. Largely because the way aggro is handled in Interlink is that when you interlink, right, you effectively zero out your enmity because you effectively become a new combatant. So for instance, one of your main tanks in the game, he doesn't have to be, but let's hypothetically, right, Lance was my main tank for the majority of the game, right? He starts off the game as a tank, right, and he pairs with a character named Senna, who is a DPS more or less, right? And for the most part, both of them can be tanks, and at a couple of points I did have them both tank. But the problem with having two tanks in this game is that if both of your tanks happen to be the same interlink pairing, then they will both interlink and everyone will basically start getting attacked because the new form that they take will not have any enmity. Now, again, the aggro in this game is not like impossible to deal with, but it's the small things that can really change the tide of battle. There were a ton of times where I would interlink, where I run one tank for the most part. I ran one tank, and you could run two, right? Anything more than two I wouldn't recommend. And what would happen is one or more of my tanks would interlink with their partner, and then the remaining group of people will just get bodied. Now, tanks in interlink can, gain aggro, right? Mio, who is kind of a tank at the start of the game, but not really in the late game, I feel. She has a couple of moves that like let her draw aggro and stuff, but that initial couple of seconds where your party is interlinking, they have to do the animation and then they fuse together. I feel like that could have been done better. I feel like if someone is the tank and they interlink, right, you can they should retain that aggro, right? I don't know why that's not the case. It seems like it defeats the whole purpose of interlinking, which is why towards the end of the game, I didn't really interlink as much. Now, you could toggle off the AI automatically interlinking, but then in order to have them interlink, you have to manually go to one of the characters, right? Which means giving up control of the character you're on, and then have them interlink manually, which it's just a little cumbersome, right? It's one of those things I wish the game didn't do. Another thing that the game will do is the game will automatically force AI to interlink if they're low on health, which makes sense because when you interlink, you can no longer take damage. What happens is that two characters that are fused together can only stay together so long as their heat gauge has not maxed out. So what will happen is that Noah and Mio will fuse and they'll be able to stay in that form, and you can upgrade the time you can spend in this form through via upgrading. And the amount of time you'll spend in that form is determined by how much you're acting, how much you're moving around, and how much damage you're taking, right? And once it's full, you automatically delink and morph out, right? But until that point, you're able to stay in it, you don't take damage, right? It's a good way to stall, but also any healing that you receive while in interlink does not count, as well as any enmity, right, that you have is now applied to your new character in interlink. And then once you leave it, it's obviously dropped and you return to whatever you were before, presuming the enemy that you had enmity on is still alive, right? And I just kind of feel like if interlinking was a little bit smoother, maybe this wouldn't necessarily be a problem. It wasn't a big problem. I feel like for the most part, I was all right about it. It was okay, but there were a couple of times where it's like, well, now my healer got obliterated because my tank interlinked and I had no control over it because I was playing someone else. And one of the biggest things I think that they could have changed about this game, and this is something, again, from Final Fantasy XII, I don't know why it's not in more games, is I feel like characters in this game characters there should have been like a pause for the combat, right? You should have been able to pause the game. You know, if you've played Final Fantasy 12, you know what I'm talking about, where at any point you could press X, it brings up the menu, and then you could now like toggle through the menu. You could see what's afflicting different people. I think that systems like that are the next thing that they need to add to games like this, because this game is very intricate. There's a lot of stuff going on in the combat, right? Sometimes being able to pause the game is a big deal, right? It's good for new players to help them figure out what's going on, right? You have 6 people running around all fighting. You have, you know, initially it is a clusterfuck. It's very, very, very much like, I don't know what's going on. It can be overwhelming. So being able to pause, take a second, analyze what's going on could be a big boon. And then for, you know, higher level players, in those clutch moments of a fight, it can really help you stop and say, okay, pause the game, right? I want you to interlink, I want you to do this and stuff, and just I want to swap a character all at the same time, then resume combat, you know? And just having that option, I think, would make the game play a lot better. I feel like Final Fantasy 12 is such a rare, unique game that even has that, right? Being that it's also another game where all the fighting takes place on the open world and everything like that. I think that having that's like one of my biggest complaints, one of my biggest things I wish was in the game, was the ability to stop time, pause, and then analyze a situation, and then go from there. Like, on-the-fly decisions can be good, but I feel like it ups the tactical nature of the game when you can stop for a little bit and consider your actions, right? Additionally, I kind of wish you could order teammates to do more. I wish there was a better, like, ability for you to tell teammates where to go, what to stand. Even Final Fantasy 12 doesn't do this, right? So, for instance, there's a couple enemies that lay down AoEs on the floor, right? Obviously, you don't want to stand in the puddle, but you cannot tell your teammates, hey, don't stand in the puddle. You have to manually switch over to your tank, pull him out of it, and then, you know, basically hope he doesn't move or change positions, really. And I wish that there was a way for you to, like, direct your squad members to stand in certain places, right? To do certain things. Again, was not a huge problem. It's just something that I hate. If I had to critique the combat, there would be a couple of times where I wish we could have maybe pulled a couple enemies or done a couple of things. I think that would have made a big difference in a couple of fights as well. But nothing, again, I was never really, like, deadlocked on something in this game because of this. But it would have just been more helpful because, again, another part of it, probably the worst part of the combat in my opinion, is that positionals are back. And so positionals, as like with any game, you know, you could have a positional from the front, positional from the side, positional from the rear. And I find that if you have a positional from the rear, forget about ever being healed, because the heals that your healers throw out have a limited range, and therefore you will not get healed if you're trying to hit something from the back. If it's, especially since in Xenoblade you fight big monsters and big enemies, you know, like it's going to happen at some point where your DPS is going to be, you know, behind a big monster or like positioning to get a positional, and then the game will just say, oh, well, you didn't get healed, and then a big AoE will come out and it'll just completely wipe them out. And I feel like if you're gonna have enemies be this big, you kind of need to either, again, let yourself upgrade characters so they could reach that far, or just don't have ranged or limited healing, right? Like, just let people be able to heal at any range, you know? Don't make it a check to see if you're in a radius. Just say, oh, I used this move and everyone got healing, right? And the game is still challenging, don't get me wrong, but I think that positionals definitely have a negative attribute to them, because the bigger a monster is, the more likely you are that you will not be able to get healing from it. You will not be able to get healing while fighting them. A couple AoEs and you'll just be dead, and you'll be down for the count. But beyond that, let's talk about some of the things I do like in this game, right? So, for starters, the combo system, which was in Xenoblade 1 and Xenoblade 2, right? Both of them are once again in this game. That's a reoccurring theme of this game, is that it's both a combination of Xenoblade 1 and Xenoblade 2. So, for instance, the combo of Break, Topple, Daze, and now a new move called Burst is in this game, which is basically supposed to be like from Xenoblade 1, whereas Break, Topple, Launch, Smash, which was from Xenoblade 2, is also in this game as well. So certain moves and certain classes will have certain moves that will allow you to break, topple, launch, or smash an enemy. And what's cool is that each different one of them has like a different thing that it does. You could do them pretty much at any time, right? As long as you can land the previous move in the sequence, You know, if you could break an enemy, you could topple them. If you could topple an enemy, you could launch or daze them. And once you do either of those, if you follow up quickly enough, right, you'll be able to perform the finishing blow on the combo, which does a little slowdown. It does a little cool effect to show that you did it. It's hilarious as well. It's one of my favorite things about this game. But don't get it wrong, like, enemies can do it to you too. So for instance, you can also be launched and smashed and everything. It's rare, it doesn't really happen that much. But it is something worth considering. And it is something to remember when you apply your arts, right? You want to be able to have at least one of these combos available to you from your party members. So across all 6 of your party members, make sure that they all have at least one or so of these moves that they could use, right? So they can contribute to the combo. Or you could choose to forego it. I mostly chose to forego it. I didn't screw me over. The times when I did use it, however, it was very helpful. It does let you potentially stun a boss or stun an enemy a little bit so you could get the upper hand, because while an enemy's toppled, launched, dazed, and being bursted or smashed, they can attack and they have their stats reduced, and you could just deal more damage to them, which is very helpful. That's cool that those are back. Both of them are back, which once again leads to a lot more creativity. It gives you more options. It also just varies it up a bit, right? Like if the whole game was just launch smash, like it's funny, but it's cool to be able to alternate which one you want to do. Additionally, there's also chain attacks. Like I said before, chain attacks are in this game, but they don't take away a point in your gauge. Chain attacks operate, I would argue, a little more similarly to Xenoblade 1. So what will happen is that chain attacking now is a mini game rather than being random chance per se, like it was in Xenoblade 1, whether or not your attack would continue. In this game, what will happen is that each character has a specific, what they call order, chain attack order, right? It's like something that you could say, I want this, and then you build towards it, and if you complete it, you get it. So the goal of here is to pick whichever order from whatever of your six characters you want to use, and then each character will have different amounts of points that they can add to a bar, right, based on their role and their class. So for instance, you know, your DPS might have like 30 or so points, your healers might have 15, your tanks might have 20. The goal is to fill up that bar to 100. Right? And when you do, the order is considered complete, right? It'll automatically fire off, and then you get a cool animation, you deal some damage to the enemy, and then you continue to the next order as long as you have chain attack gauge energy. Now, if you fail to fill an order, the chain attack ends right there. Additionally, your role also determines how you get bonus points towards your chain attack gauge. So for instance, if you're a DPS, they advise you to use DPS first, because DPS in a chain attack order get a bonus for moving first. Healers have the unique ability of being unable to fully fill the chain attack gauge to 100, which could be helpful. I'll explain in a second. And then tanks give a bigger bonus when they move last and finish the order off. So the whole goal of it is to try to use your different characters, right, to fill this bar. And once they're used, they're gone. Now, every time you complete an order, depending on how high you got that bar, you will be able to get a character back. So for instance, if you complete an order to 100 to 149%, you will get only one character back for the next chain attack order. If you fill an order to 150 to, I think, like 175 or something, or I think it might be 200 even, you get two characters back. Right? And if you fill a goal to 200%, it basically locks at 200. You can't really go much higher than that. I think the numbers might go higher, but it doesn't change anything. You get 3 characters back, no matter how many you spent. So you can see that the goal here is to use as few characters as possible to then get the biggest score as possible, and then be able to reuse your units over and over. And then in this way, the more you complete orders, the more your damage multiplier goes up, the more damage you start dealing to the enemy that's the result of the chain attack. Now, the last thing I'll say before I get into what I don't like about chain attacks is the interlink system can also be used in the chain attack system. You can, the whole goal of it is that if you use one character and then you use their matching pair, so like if I use Noah in my first chain attack order and then I use Mio in a later chain attack order, I will get the card that will allow me to use their interlink as a chain attack all on its own. And this is called an Ouroboros order. And it's not that complex, right? It's just use two characters that are already have their interlink. You could do a special interlink attack. And whenever you select an Ouroboros order, your chain attack will end after it immediately, but you'll be able to deal big damage. All of your characters, regardless of if they're available or not, will come back. So you can freely use however you want. So the goal here is to use an Ouroboros order at the end of every chain attack, effectively, right? Now, one of the things I don't really like about this system, not that the game is hard, but I feel like you have chain attacks, but you're never really able to get chain attacks above 3, right? There's a couple ways to get around this. There's a character that lets you do it as well, which I'll explain the hero system in a minute. But you can't really like get your chain attacks above 3. For the most part, if you just do a normal chain attack, you only get to move 3 times, right? Which is kind of unfortunate. Now, there are a couple of ways around this. There's, I think, 2 or so characters that make it easy to move multiple times. You can expand the limit, but I really kind of didn't like that you can, I really didn't like that you only have 3 as your base and you're never able to upgrade it. It was kind of like, it doesn't make it harder to execute orders. It's just something I kind of felt like maybe if you could have boosted it to 4, it might give you a little bit more flexibility, right? Without having to use, a side character to do it as well. But again, the game isn't too hard, so it kind of didn't matter. Additionally, I don't like that you can't AoE with chain attacks. I kind of wish there was an alternate version for like if you're fighting multiple enemies at the same time. Again, this could be a menu option in like this hypothetical menu system I'm thinking of. Instead of just pushing start, maybe there's like a little button that says area chain attack, which will hit everything you're fighting, or focus chain attack, right? That way you could choose, do I want to pile a lot of damage onto one enemy I'm fighting, or do I want to hit everything that I'm fighting at the same time? It would just save a little bit of time in areas, right, where you're fighting, multiple enemies that are reasonably tough, right? Which leads me to my final point. Chain attacks are very time consuming, and I shouldn't complain about something so helpful taking a couple, a minute or 2 extra, but it really started to dawn on me, I want to say like 2/3 of the way through the game, like, yeah, chain attacks are pretty reliable. You more or less get them every big fight you have. But what ends up happening is that, like, you go into it and it's like an extra 3 minutes added onto the fight. And, like, it's worth going into chain attacks because when you kill an enemy with a chain attack, you enter what's called overkill. And basically, you can't kill it anymore, right? Overkill by definition is you've killed it using the chain attack. You get a big experience bonus when you overkill enemies, right? And obviously leveling up good, right? No matter what game you're playing. So I think the biggest thing I would say about it is that the chain attack system isn't bad. I just wish it was faster, more faster pace. It's like with Tokyo Mirage Sessions, and I know they fixed this in Encore. You do one attack and then your sessions begin, and then immediately it's like I want to say like a 15-minute cutscene where all your party members jump out to fight, right? And like it's a cool system at first because it's like, oh, it's fun to watch it, but I would wish there was an option to speed it up, basically is what I'm saying. Like, especially the Ouroboros orders, that's the actual like meme of like JRPG attack animations that are like 20 seconds long. It is literally the meme. And it's cool at first, but after a while you begin to realize you've seen all these animations, Now, each animation that your characters do when they're not interlinked is determined by their class. So that's not like the worst thing ever, right? I didn't mind that at all. But your interlink animations, once you've seen all 6 of them, you've seen them, right? Obviously, you'll see some more than others. For instance, I didn't really see my healer characters interlinks too much. But I think what could be cool is if you could customize the orders a little bit. That might also help, because I feel like some characters were just not very helpful with their orders sometimes. And sometimes I felt like they didn't work. Like, there's one that's supposed to, like, increase defender enmity or reduce healer and attacker enmity, and I just felt like it never worked, right? For some reason, it was never really explanatory if it did or didn't work. But yeah, like, I don't hate chain attacks. I think my biggest complaint is that there's not an area version for when you're fighting generic enemies in the field. Speaking of field, there's field effects that you can lay down on the ground. There's HP recover, there's defense up, recharge speed up is something I mentioned, arts recharge, attack up. And now I don't know if the game tells you this, so I can't knock the game for it, but you can only have 3 of these down at any given time. Now at the beginning of the game, when your options are low and you don't have a ton of classes or access to a lot of these, it's not a big deal, right? Like, who cares? But what will happen is that as you play the game more and more, you'll gain, ideally you run at least 2 healers, I feel, right? When you have 2 healers, running around doing whatever, I think that a big problem with the, or not a big problem, but what the game doesn't tell you is that you can only have 3 circles down, 3 field effects at any given point. And then anything beyond that just disappears. It just doesn't, just the earliest one place gets removed. Not a big deal. As soon as I realized that, I was like, okay, I'll just do the other thing, because there's an incredibly broken healer class in this game. And if you watched my playthrough, or if you've played the game, you know exactly what it is. Complete endgame material, by the way. But let's talk about how you get classes, right? Because I've talked a lot about all these classes in the game. When you start the game, each character has their own unique class, which is dictated by the role that they've been given by their nation. And when you actually like put them together and you get all 6 of the party members together for the first time, this isn't really one of those games, I think, where the party members split up for the most part. I could think of maybe 2 circumstances where you don't fight with a full group, and even then I don't think that it really, like, it's like Final Fantasy 12 again, where all the characters mostly stay together. You don't really lose anybody throughout the game, right? So your options are almost always open to you regardless of what fight you have. But the way you get classes is by doing what's called hero quests, right? So I've said up to this point you could have 6 people in your party. Actually, you can have a 7th person. You cannot control them. You cannot customize their equipment and their gems, but they will come into combat. They have slightly altered moves to make up for that fact, right? And you will be able to control them, or you will be able to have them fight alongside you. So you could take an extra DPS, you could take an extra healer, you could take an extra tank if you want, right? Now, I have my favorites, for what I like. I preferred healers, extra AI healers. I feel you lose the least, right? That's just me. Feel free to experiment as you want. But what you do is each one of these characters has a quest, and if you complete that quest, you gain access to what's called their hero class, right? Their class themselves. And this is the primary method in this game of getting multiple classes and being able to do multiple things. And this is what makes this game so fun, is that you can have all these different classes. It encourages you to go out and look for these characters, right? Solve their quests, and because there's a direct reward for it, right? You might gain access to a class that has a really good move or a really good set of a skill, right? And then you can equip that onto your character. So that's all well and good, right? But what happens is that each class in the game, including the ones that you start with, is locked to rank 10 to start. And then in order to get it to rank 20, you have to find and complete that character's ascension quest, right? Usually it's like a culmination of their plot arc. It's a little hard to find these. Throughout the game, I only missed one of the main classes. I didn't know how to unlock it. I'm sure it's behind a bunch of quests or something. But I didn't really find a lot of ascension quests. Now, some of your main characters' ascension quests are tied to the story, right? Because again, there's supposed to be story-driven moments, right? Story-driven plot lines that expand the universe or character histories, which is amazing. I love that in games now. But, it's optional, right? It's more optional than finding these different classes. So there's a good chance you might beat the game and only maybe do a couple of them, which is fine. But the bonus is that you're able to level up your class above 10 to a maximum of 20 if you complete your quest. And what happens is that when you max out a class, the higher you rank up a class, the more abilities and skills you unlock from that class that can be then used if you're another class. So for instance, there's a healer in the game called Medic Gunner, right? It's one of the classes you get at the start of the game. If you level it up to rank 10, right, and then take that character who leveled it up and put them on another class, an Agnes-based class, because Medic Gunner is a Kevas-based class. If you put that character on an Agnes-based class, they can take abilities from that class. Now, you can't take any of the abilities available. You can only take a predetermined selection that the game has already chosen for you. I'd rate it like a B, right? I kind of wish you could take whatever you want, but I see how it's part of balancing, I guess. So it's not like game, again, it doesn't ruin the game. It's not like it prevents you from beating it or having a good class setup. In fact, I'd argue by the end of the game, everything came together for almost every one of my characters so well, I more or less floored right through the end of the game. And I was having a good time because I'd leveled, I'd done all the quests, or not all, but I'd done a lot of quests. I'd done a lot of, different class customization and stuff. So I had a good time with that. I think that that's fine. The Ascension quests are good. They add more story. They give you incentive to go back, learn about the characters, do different things. So yeah, I think that's fine. Now, this has already been long enough. I've gone over a lot of stuff. So let's move on to the next topic. Skills, like I said, are different things that your class learns. Now, by default, each class that you have has 4 skills automatically equipped, except for one class. It's a special class. I don't want to go into it. But by default, each class has a special skill that is automatically equipped, right? Like you automatically have that class and you can use it. So, all 4 of those skills are always on for that class, and this is what determined for me a lot of what in-game classes I use. You have 4 skills that are mandatorily locked on a class you cannot change, right? You are able to then customize and take 3 additional skills from any of the other classes that you've leveled up and unlocked. Once you've gotten into that level, it becomes available for any class to take. But I think the biggest thing to take away from this is that, at the start of the game, again, the aggro with that one ability is a little, where that one skill can be a little bit wishy-washy without it. Because it's a higher level skill unlocked at 15, which means you need the Ascension quest. But it gives a reason to also do Ascension quest beyond the story, because that's how you really begin to build characters really well. So I actually really like that. I thought that was like a fun part, right? You could pick 3 different skills, right? It allowed me to see, okay, well, which class is really good at what, right? There's definitely a meta of classes at play here. Which is good to play around with and experiment with. Skills can determine a lot in this game, like your healing power, your enmity generation, your the placement of extra positional arts or field arts. Very important stuff. I already went over hero quests. I already went over interlink. I already went over AI. What's nice, again, is that you could jump during combat. Oh, no, I'm sorry. One thing I wish you could do is that you could roll during combat, right? So you can quickly reposition on the field by clicking one of the sticks. I think it might be the right stick. I forget. It's basically like a faster way to move, like, because one of my complaints of Xenoblade 2 was that you can't really move and fight, right? Like, you have to either pick between doing damage and keeping your cooldown running or moving. In this game, not only are the auto attacks normalized, so you can't exploit it like you could in Xenoblade 2 with fast weapons, which is good because it means the system is more balanced. Your auto attacks happen pretty regularly, right? You're able to move in between them and still maintain uptime. And also now you can dodge roll. Now, it doesn't let you roll out of attacks, because every attack is, there's no accuracy, there's no, like, missing. I mean, there is missing, but you can't physically roll out of an attack that's going to hit you, right? It's all determined by the game. The dice have already been thrown. But on the flip side, I like that it lets you quickly reposition around the field, maybe for extra healing or just to move something fast. Now, I wish you could jump during combat. I think, like, that could add to some extra gameplay, right? Maybe it could change some moves if you jump and use them. There's a couple parts where you're fighting on, like, a cliff or something, and literally the only way you can go is down because you cannot jump up a cliff or anything during combat. Now, one of the biggest positives of this game is that you can do fighting while swimming, right? Which I think is awesome. That is an amazing addition. I'm really happy that they added that. That is really good, right? And then they bring back the usual set of enemies. There's rare enemies, which give extra loot when they're killed, which they're not that rare. I started seeing them all the time over the course of the game. There's elites. There's name monsters, right, which are your big, struggle fights. The elite monsters are just like sort of bigger, more higher level enemies that give better, bonus rewards and everything if you can kill them. And then your name monsters are your usual, like, specific Xenoblade monsters you seek and destroy. Now, when you kill them, they drop a gravestone, which can be used as either a fast travel point or, if you want to rematch them later. And there's a specific reason why you'd want to rematch them later, which I won't get into. It's part of a class thing. Additionally, this game has a very heavy social element to it, not with online players, but with players, with characters in the game, right? there's you as Noah and Mio are off seers, like I said long ago, you can have them see off different members or of the various nations who have fallen in combat. You find their bodies and then you can send them off, basically. You know, it's like a burial, it's like a funeral service out in the field. That raises your ranks with different colonies. Now, the colonies in this game are basically like the towns for the most part. They're, you know, that's where you do the shopping, you get items, you find quests for the most part. Each colony plays a role. They're either part of Keves or Agnes, and then your whole goal of it is to find all the different colonies, and then like basically you can help them out. You could do quests for them and raise your affinity with them. Vendors and merchants will also gain stock and stuff you could buy and sell as usual. Now, my biggest complaint about this part of the system is that money is kind of worthless in this game, right? Like, because there's not armor or anything for your characters to buy, right? Like, most of the good gear is dropped from combat. I felt like money is kind of worthless. Like, there's nothing really worth converting money into in this game. So by the end of the game, like, I bought at least one of everything that I wanted to get, and I had like millions of gold. Like, there was nothing to buy with money in this game. Unlike Xenoblade 1 and maybe 2, right? And there's just nothing to buy. Now, I mean, like, the best items I found from fighting enemies, you know? There's item rarities in this game, right? There's normal, there's purple, and then there's yellow, right? Yellow being the best, right? Yellow being crazy good. And I just kind of regret that, like, I wish there was something worth using your money on, you know? So, I digress, right? There's also broken down Pharaonises, which are basically like big, like, mecha units that you can find in the field. You can use what's called ether cylinders to repair them and get them running. Now, the main purpose of this is to set up, like, a place for, you know, a rest zone where you could level up, have dialogue with your party members and stuff like that. But also it gives a fast travel point, and also it brings a merchant to the area, and also it allows you to use a manufacturer. Now, these just kind of spit out random items. Again, I wish that this was where the money system went. You know, you could maybe put money in and then it would spit out, you know, certain items that you want, right? Because that would help with another system I'm going to talk about, which is the gem system, right? So in this game, like I said earlier, your equipment in this game comes down to a couple of different things, right? You have your actual equipment that you give your characters, you have your skills that you give them from their classes, right? You have their abilities, and then you also have what are called gems. And basically your gems are just like materia, jewels that give you bonus perks, like bonus stuff. So like there's a gem that, for example, increases your healing stat. There's a gem that increases the aggro you generate. There's a gem that lets you deal more damage or lets your damage over time effects hit for more or last longer, right? There's they're separated into 4 categories. Tank, damage, healing, and then a general category, right? So for the most part, it's pretty straightforward, like, you know, what you'd want to use on them, right? But I think the biggest problem with it is that the upgrading of gems is both ingenious and also incredibly needlessly confusing at the same time. So the good news is that gems have ranks of up to 10. And if you craft a higher rank than the one that you're up to, you automatically just go up to that higher rank. So let's say I'm up to rank 2, right? And I need to craft rank 3. If I craft like a rank 5 gem, I never need to craft ranks 3 and 4. I just go rank to gem level 5. And it gives me full credit for the ones before. But now the negative of that is that a lot of the end game gems are locked behind either getting 99 of some amount getting 99 of some gem or of some material, and you need 5 materials to get these things, or it's locked behind, you know, like killing big monsters, and they don't tell you where to get these items, right? Like in most Xenoblade games, there's like a collectopedia which tells you where each item can be found. In this game, they only do it for some items, and I never really understood it. So by the end of the game, I was just like, I just kind of don't want to do this anymore. So I just wish that it was a little bit less frustrating trying to find all these items. Not to mention you have to grind out and find, like, is it 99 or is it like 30? It's like a high number. I think it's 30 actually. And you need to get 30 of these items, right? It's like, but I don't even know where they drop from. So unless you want to go around killing every enemy in the world multiple times over, you know, to maybe see if you could find where this drops and, you know, whatever, then sure. But until then, I kind of just feel like you shouldn't do that. That's just my opinion. I wish that they had handled that a lot better. I wasn't a big fan of it. That said, you can use what are called silver and gold Nopon coins in order to bypass certain things. So for instance, cooking meals gives you benefits at a campfire. You can use Nopon coins, silver Nopon coins, to automatically make that meal, or you could use the materials if you have them. Personally, I ended up using coins because the materials are very enemy specific, and I just didn't want to go back and farm them. Right? I did a lot in this game. Farming was not one of those things, actually, believe it or not. So that's why I kind of enjoyed it, because I didn't really farm most of this game. It wasn't even until the literal end of the game, like the final session, I actually did grinding in this game, believe it or not. But at the same time, silver and gold Nopon coins are limited. You could use gold Nopon coins to buy items from a certain vendor, or you could use it to buy, what was it? Buy gems. You could fast track and upgrade gems, but it gets increasingly expensive the higher rank of gem that you want to get, and the only way to get gold Nopon coins is to fight and kill named monsters for the first time. And then once you've done that, you're out. There's only a finite amount in the game, to my knowledge. There might be a finite amount of silver as well. Now, if you could convert money into these, maybe it would be a little bit different, but again, you cannot. So the last thing that I would say is that I wish there was more of a usage for money. I feel like a couple of these systems, if they fed into each other better, would be just better, right? So like you could use money, you accumulate all this money, you could use money to buy certain items from a manufacturer, which would then give a reason to use them. And then, you know, using that, you could use that to upgrade your gems. Your gems would therefore improve your combat viability, especially for tanks and healers and anyone who needs it, right? And then the system could feed itself. You know what I mean? Like if you were able to directly spend money to do it, even if it was very expensive, right? Like 100,000 for one, at least it gives a goal, at least it's a purpose, right? At least you're able to then say, okay, well, I know what my money's going for. I know there's a reason to sell the items I don't want, right? And yeah. Other than that, I wish that some of those systems linked together, right? But the equipment system, I said a couple of times, I wish you could equip more. I don't know what it is about games where they took away like the 5 basic slots that you use to equip your characters, right? Their pants, their chest, their head, their gloves, and their boots. I don't know why they've done away with that in games. Now, this is more of just a me thing. I like it when you have that in games. I think it gives a level of intricacy, right? Obviously, this game already gives more than the average one, so it's kind of not a thing I hold against it. I just wish it was something that they did. And lastly, the thing I'll talk about, I guess, at this point is the world map. This world is huge. Now, it's not the biggest world ever, right? Like, it's still pretty linear. You know, you kind of move around the world for the story in a very linear loop fashion. But I do like that there's a lot of side areas to explore, a lot of places you could check out, right? Like I said, I didn't grind until literally the set right before the final session just to get a couple of my classes in line and a couple of other things done. So for the most part, like, you don't need to really grind. There's enough to explore and enough things to do that I feel are meaningful that you don't grind in this game. So that's why everything is a constant step forward. I really like that about this game. The areas are big, the monsters are big, there's a huge variety in this game, right? And I think that this is one of the things that Xenoblade is good at, is having these big open areas with big monsters roaming around them and things to see and monsters to fight. That's like one of the key things I would say about Xenoblade since even the first game, right? When you get on the Gower Plains and you see all the things running around, it's cool. It's a really cool looking thing. A really cool looking environment. It's a really awesome to play Xenoblade X and to like fly around this huge fully formed world. It's still their biggest world in my opinion. X is on another level, right? I think that's one of my biggest positives about X. And lastly, I think that combat is very fluid, right? It was very rare that combat chugged along, right? I think that they did a good job of making this game work decently on the Switch, right? As much as the Switch can handle. I love how this game looks. I think the characters look really good. I think the voice acting for the English dub is very well done, right? I think there's a lot of good things about this game in terms of how it's presented and the story and everything. And ultimately, I felt very satisfied having played it, right? I think Xenoblade 3 is like the perfect culmination of effectively a decade of Xenoblade games coming and going, right? remembering Monolith Soft had Xenosaga and Xenogears kind of go nowhere. To see them come together in this game, I guess I feel a certain type of way about it, right? I appreciate what Takahashi and Monolith Soft set out to do. I think that they really achieved it in this game. And so, because of that, Xenoblade 3 is one of my favorite JRPGs I played in my life. It's one of my favorite JRPGs I played for the channel. I would almost argue, yes, the favorite. So what would I give Xenoblade Chronicles 3 for the Nintendo Switch? Man, I'm going to tell you, this game blew me the fuck away. I'm going to give Xenoblade Chronicles 3 a 97 out of 100. I think that even with some of the gripes of the combat, I think that a lot of the gameplay is still very solid. It's still very fluid. There's a lot of systems I wish that tied together a bit more, right? Because I got so into the game, I did it for 80 hours. I'm able to really look into it and see, like, a lot of these things make a lot of sense. I thoroughly had fun with Xenoblade from either the story or from the gameplay or anything like that. It was a very fulfilling game from start to finish. My biggest complaint is that it ends, right? It's the same thing I say about Three Houses and Ghost of Tsushima. My biggest complaint, as much as I love this game, is that it ends. And that makes me very sad. But I mean, memeing aside, I thoroughly enjoyed this game. I think it's a masterpiece of a game, a wonderful addition to the series, and a great way to cap off everything. I'm looking forward to the DLC. Unlike Xenoblade 2, which I thought was kind of meh, it wasn't that great. It wasn't really it wasn't a great time for the most part, right? Like, Xenoblade 3 knocks it out the park, and I really almost have to fight the urge to go back and play more, because I want to actually play other games. So with that in mind, thank you all for listening to this very, very long edition of The Verdict. I really am passionate about this game because I think they put in a lot of work to really make it stand out and be fun. It was a very enjoyable game. I hope you get to pick it up at some point, and I hope to see you guys at some point in the future. Thanks so much, and I will see you for the next one.